welcome to another episode of Rustacean Station. I'm your host, Alan Wyma. Today I'm talking with Lukas Wirth. Hopefully I said that okay. You're smiling. I don't know if that's true or not. He is maintainer of Rust Analyzer. Welcome, Lukas. How are you?
Hello, I'm fine. Glad to be here.
I didn't butcher your name, did I?
No, that was pretty close, I would say.
Oh,
But it's Lukas Wirth.
So if I called you on the phone and said, I'm looking for Lukas Wirth, do you think I was German?
Maybe not.
The looking for part maybe gives it away?
The vowel is cut a bit short, I think.
That's okay. Yeah, we were talking quite a bit before the show. You work at Ferris Systems, right?
Yeah, that's correct. I'm a software engineer at Ferris.
Okay. And are you primarily just focusing on Rust Analyzer, or what kind of work are you doing over there?
So I started out as a working student for Ferris, where I just was paid to work on Rust Analyzer a bit, to maintain it. Then my tasks got shifted around a bit. So I started working on the Ferrocene language specification, which is basically just like specifying the current Rust compiler for the Ferrocene project. So just like specifying the language basically as it's currently accepted by the compiler. And from there on, I basically got back into working on Rust Analyzer a bit, and then also on like other contracts we do at Ferris. And right now I'm also like back on working on Rust Analyzer a bit more since we still have some budget there. And that's basically what I'm doing right now.
For the budget for that, is that coming from Ferris Systems itself or outside, or a little bit of both?
No, that's coming from outside. So it's also the fiscal host for Rust Analyzer, or rather not really the core project anymore, since that has moved into the Rustlang organization now. And the org does not want to have like any donation funds directly associated with it. So now it's the Ferris Systems Rust Analyzer Fund, I think it's called. But that's basically where the current money comes from for funding employee work on that.
Okay, so is that coming from like outside different sources of donations, or is that coming specifically only from like, what's it called, from the Rust Foundation?
No. So the money itself comes from donations and sponsors. So basically mainly GitHub sponsors for the still existing Rust Analyzer organization, which is also again managed by Ferris still. And otherwise it comes from the open collective that Ferris is hosting for Rust Analyzer as well. That's currently the main income for funding Ferris employees to work on Rust Analyzer.
Okay, that's good. So that's probably going straight to Ferris and then going straight to you through just your normal paycheck, right? Or you get like a bonus for working on this?
Yes. No, it's basically, it goes into Ferris bank accounts, whatever. And from there on, we then pay that out to employees to spend their time on.
Got it.
Rust Analyzer specifically.
Okay, that's pretty cool. And I know this kind of stuff can be quite tricky to when it goes to like a private company and goes to another private individual.
We also still have the problem. Usually we like bring out a blog post that slightly like outlines the money that was made, the money that was spent, and so on in rough terms, just to communicate. And we are kind of lacking behind that at the moment. I think the last was like 2 years ago. I'm working on that to get that out in the next month now, so we can get back on track with like being transparent. Was always a bit hectic because as Rust Analyzer has moved into the Rustlang organization, the money stuff obviously was like a problem. How do we disconnect like the Ferris fund from Rust Analyzer itself, since the connection isn't really welcome there in the Rustlang org, as it has specific guidelines as to not labeling any funding source as official, basically, for the project itself. So we had to figure out like, how do we disconnect this properly? And from there on, I think it just got forgotten to like talk about where was the money spent and so on now. We still have everything recorded, it's just it hasn't been put into a blog post yet.
That's interesting. I'm just kind of curious, right? I don't want to talk, I feel weird talking about money and funding wherever it goes. I mean, I like the fact that you guys are having accountability, and of course, I think you have to. It would look really weird if just thousands of euros are just disappearing out of a bank account and people are saying, how does this work? I mean, when you're working on this project, do you have like a task list and you're saying, okay, this is my rate or something, and this is, how much time I spent on these, or how does this kind of get matched up?
It's basically we just check what is the current budget and like check how far would the budget go if we assign this many hours per month for employees, whatever. Then basically we just assign like, well, here you have, I don't know, 6 hours a week you can spend on Rust Analyzer work, and then it's basically just like pick what you want, like work on anything that improves Rust Analyzer, be it code, be it infrastructure, organization issues, anything that's somehow related to the project, basically.
Oh, okay. So it doesn't even have to even be code, right? You said you could be structural things within the organization.
Yeah. For example, when we moved the Rust Analyzer project into the Rustlang organization, I don't quite remember when it was, I think in March last year, April, somewhere around there. There was obviously basically no coding work at all. It was just like communicating with like other team members and whatnot. That also counts basically, because it is work to improve the project, right? Because like getting it into the Rustlang organization was a big thing. It basically means like Rust Analyzer has been recognized as a proper part of the project. And so we get like certain things like a Rust subcomponent, for example, and whatnot.
So, I mean, if you're sending out emails and communicating, you really document, okay, I spent this much time talking to this person, or I drafted this email, or how clear is the record keeping?
The record keeping on that is not really documented too much. Basically, we just like note down roughly, we've done this today and this today, but like not necessarily like certain hours. Like at Ferris, we basically work with like trust-based shifts. It's not quite the term I'm looking for, but like basically like the hours you work are just trust-based. So I think that has to change now because of German law. We now have to properly record hours better, but so far we don't like do bookkeeping for like every single task. We just say, I implemented like this feature today and fixed a few bugs, for example. That's how detailed it sometimes go, at least from my side.
Okay. Now, you would never do something like, oh, we celebrated a awesome feature. We went out and spent this much money on beers and pizza, and this would never happen, right?
That was to happen. That would go out of Ferris' pocket itself, if anything. That's again, like really, we have basically just a big Excel sheet with like all the money things in regards to Rust Analyzer, and we just strictly pull away from that. Either pay Ferris employees per hour, or what we also sometimes do, and what we haven't done the last year, unfortunately, is pay out a bit of money to bigger contributions from other people that are not like associated with Ferris.
Or like a bonus, like somebody been committing lots of patches.
We've paid out to some people in the past. Those are also like noted down in the blog post usually. Again, we haven't done that last year because the finances stuff wasn't really followed up properly last year. It was a bit hectic for us there.
Okay.
But I hope we are going to do it this year again. It would be nice, since it's an incentive for people to work on the project that are not associated with us.
It can be if you set the right expectation, right? Because, I mean, it's usually more of like a reward base rather than like, okay, if you submit a patch and we're going to give you, €5 or something, right?
Yeah. So far, like we're paying out usually is like €5,000 because those were like paid out to people that were spending a lot of time on it, like in their free time, just recurring. Like someone implemented like the entire macro implementation, for example, in like a year or something over many pull requests and whatnot. And that's, for example, where we then pay out because they spend a lot of time on it. So it is quite subjective where we would pay out. Basically, do we think this is like something that was really a lot of effort to put in? Stuff like that.
Okay. That's pretty nice. I mean, and I'm sure they weren't expecting that. It's like they get an email saying, hey, you have been doing a good job. Here's €5,000.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't the one that paid them out. Basically, these payments happened before I joined Ferris, usually. And I think the last one when I joined Ferris. So I'm not quite sure how that all went. But I can imagine it was quite a surprise for some of them, since it's quite a bit of money and not something we were like really advertising with, like, here, contribute this much time into Rust Analyzer and you will get paid out now. It's not like we do something like that.
Yeah, as an American, I think if I got that, I think I'd be a little bit annoyed because it's like, oh, I have to write this down on my taxes. What is this even even supposed to be? You get taxed for like everything, right? So that's just the first thought that comes to my mind. I like money, but this is really worth it. Maybe I just give it to charity. I don't know. But on all seriousness, that's really cool. I like that incentive. Yeah, I just hope that people don't come in like, oh, I'm going to get a big payout. But I'm sure like what I usually hear, it's kind of like when you write a book, you spend, maybe you get like a $20,000 check as like an initial, like whatever it's called, but you spent way more than that if you actually spent all the time doing actual work, right? I'm sure that 5,000 euros, like let's just say even like 100 euros an hour, it's too late over here for me to do math, but you maybe have done 10 times the amount. So it's kind of like a small thing. Maybe it'll help pay for some electricity that you used, or replacing one of the components in your computer, your CPU, to something a little bit faster so you can do a little bit more work next time. I don't know. But in any case, it's a fantastic thing that people give out, that you guys give out. And I think that's pretty cool. Now, the Rust Analyzer, right? I want to kind of get back to that.
Yeah.
So obviously you came onto the project when there was already a Rust Analyzer, right? You weren't there from the very beginning.
Yes, I joined pretty late.
Okay.
I think I joined the project, I think at the end of 2020 is when I started contributing. And like after a few months, I got invited to the GitHub org. And from there, I just climbed up, I guess you could say. I mean, I am now the lead of the working group for Rust Analyzer. So I guess I am currently the head in that regard. And unfortunately, the project doesn't have too many active contributors, like regular contributors either. It's basically me and I think 2 other people, one of which is just mainly doing the weekly releases, which I'm very glad for. I wouldn't want to do those, to be honest, since it's just like collecting changelog things and then write the quick changelog post and then do the release and so on. And given how GitHub sometimes likes to not cooperate with us, the release has to be done like 2 or 3 times until it works.
Oh, yeah. All the developers love documentation, but none of us like to write documentation.
Yeah.
Especially change logs. Those are always tricky. So, I mean, how did you get promoted to the lead of that? I mean, what happened to the previous lead when you joined?
So, I mean, basically, Rustalyzer was started by Alexei Kladov, I think is how you pronounce his name, which is pretty known in the Rust community, I would say, who's also responsible for the IntelliJ plugin. And he built that up, I don't know, 5 years ago, 6 years ago. I'm not sure how old Rustalyzer actually is. And like he was basically the lead of the working group since the very beginning. Roughly 2 years ago, he basically pulled back from working on the project because he wanted to do other things, which is obviously completely fine. But he's been the lead on paper since then still. And so I basically just went and asked if it would make sense if I could put myself down the list, since I am the most active contributor at the time. And like if other people from the Rust project want to reach out to Rustalyzer for organizational matters or whatnot, they would obviously reach out to the lead position, which in that case isn't really active. So that's pretty much how it went. So basically, I got promoted in the sense because I've been the most involved in the project for that matter.
I see. Do you feel a lot of pressure on that? Because that's a lot of pressure, right? A lot of people are talking about Rust Analyzer and how good it is. I haven't heard any complaints that I can think about.
I don't feel pressure in the position. The thing is, I mean, yeah, you do read a lot about Rustalyzer here and there on many platforms and whatnot. But at the same time, I feel like most of them really only know the tool and not the people behind it at all. So thinking about that, I kind of feel like I am not really visible in that regard. So that there's not much pressure there. And obviously, like whenever I read like comments about the tool, like be it on Reddit from the changelog post, for example, there's usually just like a lot of good comments and whatnot. So, which obviously is a nice feeling, like reading satisfactory comments from people about the thing you're working on. It's always nice. So I haven't really been like in any situation where I felt pressured in any way, really. At least not so far.
Yeah. But I mean, I can imagine like, because everybody talks about Rust Analyzer. There's another one that competes with Rust Analyzer, but I forgot the name. What's the other one? There's another similar tool. Am I remembering wrong?
You mean the JetBrains plugin or?
No, I thought there was another one. Maybe I'm remembering wrong. It might be another language I'm thinking about. I thought there was 2 different ones. I'm talking about Rust Analyzer. Everybody talks about it and kind of has an idea what it is. I think a lot of people kind of get into it like tell you when things are not going good. When you type some code, maybe I think it may also give you some auto completion, I believe too, right? I mean, the definition on the Rust Analyzer page is extremely vague, I think. I mean, I'll just read it out. Rust Analyzer is an implementation of language server protocol for the Rust programming language. What does that even mean, right? Who wrote this definition? You're laughing. It seems like you didn't even. You also don't really like the definition so much.
That's like one of the many user-facing shortcomings Rustacean has, I think. We don't present the tool in a nice way at all. Like the README is like the shortest README I've ever read for anything like this, I think. And I mean, just describing it as a language server implementation doesn't really help anyone that doesn't know the language server implementation or what the LSP really is. But yeah, that's kind of circling back to like no one really likes to write comments or documentation rather. That goes for Rustacean.
If you were to explain what Rust Analyzer is in just very basic words, how would you explain to somebody who's maybe brand new to Rust and you think that they should install this?
Yeah, right. That's a good point. I would describe it as, an integrated development environment, right? So a tool that basically just helps you write code and like look up things mainly, like looking up documentation in an easy, accessible way, seeing in part what the compiler does. Like it's difficult to describe, I think, something like this. But like it complements like the compiler quite well, I think, because the compiler has great diagnostics, as everyone knows, right? So if something goes wrong, you can see it that way. Though Rustacean unfortunately put just some of those diagnostics. But aside from that, Rustacean therefore can like help you write things quicker. It can like automatically apply the diagnostics for you, refactor your code. I don't know how to describe a tool like this, to be honest. It's kind of difficult for me.
Yeah, I guess maybe how I would say it provides some feedback. It's almost like, I would say just IntelliSense would be one way to kind of say it, but that may not encompass all the features. Like if you open up an IDE and you can mouse over things, you could see some information about, maybe what kind of data is in this variable. I'm not talking about runtime necessarily or a debug time.
Yeah, like showing the infer types and whatnot.
Infer types. And before you even run like cargo check or cargo build, or even cargo run, of course, which I think probably calls cargo build underneath the hood or something, it's going to, tell you that, hey, this is not going to work out. I think that already does something like that, right? I'm guessing it probably hooks into the compiler, right?
We do have our own diagnostics as well. So you don't need to run the entire compilation chain to just get like feedback. But obviously, like our diagnostics game is very far behind that of Rust. Like we have our own type mismatch diagnostics, so we can see if like types are not matching up and report that to the user, which mostly works the same as for Rust. We still have like a few points where mismatches from the actual compiler implementation, but that is already working pretty well in that regard. But aside from like type mismatches, we don't really have that many diagnostics yet. So not using cargo check to get feedback from the compiler and just relying on Rustacean telling you things are wrong, we are unfortunately quite far away from like having this kind of workflow yet, because there are so many diagnostics that have to be implemented, and Rustacean doesn't really have that many people working on it. So from what it looks like to me is that the compiler is just running further in like implementation, where Rustacean is really struggling with like keeping up with the language changing, because we just don't have the resource that like the compiler has. Like if we compare, we have like 2-3 people working on Rustacean, which is kind of a compiler itself. And then we have like a bunch of teams, like 50, 100 people working on the actual compiler itself.
You feel overwhelmed, right? Like, how can we help these people write Rust code if the Rust people just keep adding more things?
I don't know. I probably sound a bit annoyed now. I mean, I am a bit annoyed about how much like work is flowing into the Rust compiler, but how little is actually like going into Rust Analyzer itself. It sometimes feels like that the project doesn't really want to care too much about Rust Analyzer in some regards. That sounds a bit mean, I think, but it sometimes feels like that because, I mean, obviously the compiler is more important. There's no question there. But a lot of people are depending on like Rust Analyzer and the like, and yet there's not that much going on there, it seems.
Yeah, and it's kind of funny too that it's like, well, nowadays it's like you can't really write Rust without Rust Analyzer, at least not reliably.
Yeah, I
I
mean,
mean, you can, but it's kind of like writing Java without an IDE. It's like when you have to start renaming things, it's like forget about it.
yeah. Obviously, right now there are like two main options, being Rust Analyzer and the JetBrains IDE, which, from what I've heard, both are pretty much equal in terms of usability. It's just like some have the other, like some have strengths here, one of them, and the other has a strength point here and whatnot. But I do have seen like tweets about people actually just saying that they do not use an IDE at all for like writing Rust, which is honestly quite surprising to me. Like Rust doesn't feel like a language that you want to like write without like any tooling like that. It's just way too helpful, like just getting completions and like being able to, I don't know, hover over things to see the documentation immediately. Just like the language is too complex for like not using an integrated development environment, I think.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, Rust Analyzer has been, I think, a godsend for a lot of people. And the other thing is something that everybody depends upon, I think, and nobody really ever thinks about being there, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I've also seen like some fun messages regarding that. Sometimes people jokingly like were saying things like they rely on Rust Ladder so much they couldn't write Rust without it anymore. And I've also seen like someone say before that they actually stopped using Rust Analyzer because they fear they will be too reliant on it in a way that they cannot write Rust code without it, which sounds kind of funny, but it is a bit weird. I mean, you are using the tool because it helps you. So even if you get reliant on it, I don't really see the problem. It's not like you want to write Rust without the tool at any point, anyways. But it's interesting, like seeing these perspectives from some people in regards to like using these kinds of tools to help you write Rust code, because they are varying by quite a lot. It seems some people are very restrictive in what they allow themselves to use, and some just take everything they can to make it as easy as possible.
Oh, yeah. That's interesting about that. I don't want to be too reliant. I understand the feeling on that. But at the same time, like I said, I just think back to my days of working in the bank, with Java. I don't think I could ever write Java without an IDE. It's not that I feel like I'm losing brain power or something, but it's just hard because Java class names are so long and so descriptive that I want to just type a couple characters and then press up and down arrow key and then enter key, or even like double click and then right click and rename all. And with IntelliJ, it's like it makes life easier. I want to do that by hand. It's not about being reliant. It's just I don't want to do it. And for Rust Analyzer, like, yeah, okay, but in the end, like, I would like to get feedback because getting compiler feedback takes even longer, right? I mean, there's a reason why we're using Rust Analyzer.
Yeah, definitely. Especially for like, as I said, Java, like verbose languages where you have to type a lot. Making it as simple as possible is obviously like a godsend, basically. So, I mean, that also goes back, like the same really applies to Rust, because Rust is not necessarily verbose, but it is explicit, which means you still have to type a lot more than in other languages,
Yeah.
right? And it just helps out a lot that way. And obviously, there are more things that make Rust, at least in my personal opinion, more cumbersome to write without any tooling in this way. Being, for example, namespace. In Rust, you have like the 3 namespaces for names, right? And while Rust does like usually have the guidelines in typing like type names in camel case or Pascal case and values in lowercase usually, quite often you still have like names that occupy like multiple namespaces with the same spelling and same casing. And well, have fun renaming one of those, but only one and not like all of. Without IDE, like you can't do a text-based replacement, right? Because then you will replace like all the namespaces. Meanwhile, an IDE, for example, can figure out this one belongs to the type namespace. This is the one that the user wants to rename, and we aren't going to touch the other two. Like these kinds of things are also like parts of why I'm wondering why people some people refuse to use these tools with like semantic knowledge, basically, because the syntax of Rust is not very differentiating between like certain semantics, which makes text-based tools not very useful. Fortunately, like things like grep work well with the language, since most constructs are like prefixed with like keywords. So grepping is usually always a great option, but that doesn't go for like all the concept in Rust, and certainly not in other languages, I imagine, at least.
Now, is there something Rust Analyzer can do better than, say, the compiler?
In better than, in like what regard would you say?
I don't know. That's a pretty good question. Like, I don't know. Maybe because some things, I mean, how do I say this? The Rust compiler is usually pretty good about giving reasons about why certain things are not possible or don't work, even with an error code, and give you even more description. But there is this like well-known issue in some web frameworks, at least I'm aware of, where if you write something wrong, you're going to get a weird error back telling you there's something wrong, but the fix for it is not clear. And I think it could be related to like the macro system or something. I'm not too sure off the top of my head. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah. I see what you mean. I would say no. So basically, Rust Analyzer is just completely inferior in that regard, I think. For one, the Rust compiler diagnostics are like a Rust student's best teacher, I would say, right? And Rust Analyzer really doesn't have like anything that explains things that well. Like, again, the diagnostics are not really that great in Rust Analyzer itself. And aside from that, there's not really anything that Rust Analyzer tries to tell the user. Rust Analyzer is really more focused on refactorings. Like, here you can do this, you can apply this assist to rewrite this match with an iflet and whatnot. That's like really where Rust Analyzer's strengths are at the moment. Though there are a few things that could be used for teaching in Rust Analyzer, which actually tried really hard to make work in it. I'm not sure if everyone is familiar with that, probably not, but there are these things called inlay hints, which are basically like virtual text in your editor that can like show certain properties. For example, a big way where it's used is like showing the types of like variables that are inferred. So if you have like a let foo equals 1, then the inlay hint would show that the foo identifier has the i32 type, like in the code itself. And Rust has like a lot of syntax sugar, or well, not syntax sugar, but like hidden things it does to make language more convenient to use. One of which is, for example, auto-referencing and auto-dereferencing. So for example, if you call like a method on some object and the method is implemented on a type that this object basically can dereference to via the deref implementation, the compiler will basically insert like a deref call and then a borrow to basically change the type of this object for the method call. And this is like things that the user could write explicitly, but the compiler does for the user. And so Rust Analyzer, for example, can, with the help of inlay hints, like show these operations that are done behind the scenes. So it can like be used to explain like these magic behavior that the compiler does otherwise not really visible. Or like another good point being lifetime elision. A lot of people don't really grasp the concept that well at the start, which is also something that the compiler does without ever showing the user really. Rust Analyzer, for example, can, again, with inlay hints, just show these elided lifetimes in the function signatures. It doesn't work that well yet because it's syntax-based, and Rust Analyzer itself doesn't really know much about lifetimes aside from that. But that's something where it could at least like shine a lot better than the compiler can, for example.
So there's definitely some things that Rust Analyzer can do that Rust Analyzer cannot do that the compiler can, right? And that's just a fact of life, and it'll never change, I believe, right? Otherwise, you'd just be building another compiler, no?
No, I mean, Rust Analyzer definitely can like be the same in that regard. It's just very difficult. Like, for example, for like the diagnostics, we would have to either re-implement them all with like the same quality of like hints and like helps and whatnot, or we need to somehow figure out how we can reuse the diagnostics the compilers implement itself, which is a massive task that is unlikely to happen. But I think at least like everything that the compiler can like do user facing wise to like show the user about things, about problems, whatnot. In theory, Rustalizer could do the same. It's just very difficult in some regards because we're lagging so far behind.
That's interesting. I mean, to me as a software developer at a high level, it's like, well, couldn't you just like take whatever the compiler has at the front end and like just decouple it and then just hook it in and you're done? But I guess it's not so simple as it sounds, right?
Yeah, unfortunately, it is not. So, like, this is basically the librarification effort, where the ideal goal is to write the compiler, the current Rust compiler, in a way that you can reuse most components of it as libraries that then ideally could be reused by Rustalizer. So far, the only thing that the compiler and Rustalizer share, though, is the parser. No, not even the lexer only. So the thing that turns the text file into tokens. And I think the type layout code is something we were able to extract like a few months ago. But aside from that, nothing is shared. And ideally, we would share more. We will probably share the next gen type solver or trait solver engine, which is currently being rewritten. And otherwise, yeah, there's not much sharing going on yet. Ideally, we would share a lot of with the Rust compiler, but the main problem is just assumptions the compiler makes versus what the IDE makes. For example, Rust compiling code like once with the compiler is like a one-shot thing, which basically means you can just allocate things a bunch, like allocate like all the identifiers you find and just throw them in an arena that is just going to get scrapped at the end of the compilation. That's what the compiler right now does. We can't do that in Rustalizer because Rustalizer is a long-standing process. We need to like basically garbage collect. We need to keep track of what is used and what is not. Because the compiler currently makes this assumption with like identifiers can live forever for the program duration, and everything builds on top of this one concept for identifiers and spans basically, which is text ranges for the compiler. We basically can't share almost anything with it because Rustalizer just cannot do it this way at the moment. Like there was a librarification effort, I think, at some point, a bigger plan to make more things reusable like this. But unfortunately, I think that fell kind of flat, and I don't think anyone is involved with that anymore. Maybe it's something that can be revived in the future. Would be very nice to see, because right now Rustalizer is just basically re-implementing all the things that the compiler does where needed.
Okay.
Which is a lot of duplication work in a sense.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything wrong with duplication, but it just depends on how you do it. I mean, I don't know. You probably never heard of the left pad issue, right?
I have heard about it, yeah.
Yeah. So just a quick reminder, if anybody at home doesn't know about left pad, there was this, sorry, I'm just going to be direct, maybe. I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings, but there's this stupid library. Sorry for being so negative in the community, but the reason I'm so upset about it is because it broke the internet. If you look it up, just, like NPM library that broke the internet, it was this left pad library. The short story is that there's this library called left pad, and all it would do is just pad text to the left for whatever size you want. So if you gave it 4 characters and say you wanted it to be 10 characters long, it would pad it with whatever you gave it, like spaces, I think was default or whatever. And so like if you ever want to build like a Christmas tree or something in your terminal, use something like left pad to make sure all the lines were, the right length or whatever. Anyways, everybody like depended upon this library, and then those packages were dependent upon other ones. And so instead of just copying this function that was rather small and just, like I said, this was a perfect case of where duplication would be good. So instead of just copying this left padded function, because that was one library with one function, if I remember correctly, if you just copied that and duplicated it, like it literally took down the internet for like one day. You may be wondering what happened that it took it down. Well, this guy had another package, I think, called HipChat or something. If I remember correctly, Alazian had a copyright on this HipChat thing. Anyways, maybe I got the names wrong, but what happened was he had another library that got a copyright claim on it. The NPM team decided to take it down. The library maintainer creator got angry and took down all of his libraries, including LeftPad, and that's when the internet went down for a day. I think it was a day, trust me. I mean, if it was any longer, you would definitely know about it. Probably just a few hours, but it was enough that everybody remembers it, if you were in web development at least.
It was a disaster, yeah.
So many websites broke because imagine that. I mean, what you should do is just rebuild your project every single time you want to put it online. So rebuilding your front end assets, and you need that left pad because everybody depends upon left pad. Now I'm starting to wonder, is left pad really that useful? I'm starting to wonder right now. How many packages need to be padded to the left now? It also offered to the right and everything else, but it's just called left pad was the name. So that's why I was thinking, like, since then and some other things kind of changed my mind about duplication. I no longer want to have like the same package being dependent upon by so many different things. Because the other issue that can happen too is that you each depend upon the same package, but maybe you have I don't know, it depends on the language, right? I think NPM, you can have multiple downloads of the same package, but different versions, and it's okay. But some libraries are very flat, some programming languages. So you can have the same library only once, and if you have conflicting versions, then you have a big problem.
Yeah, I imagine there are some. I mean, Cargo also handles different versions fine, right?
I think it's also like what I would call flat, where you can only have one. Because how do you know, like, if you try to import on the namespace, how does it know which one to use?
Yeah, so the thing is with Cargo, if your project directly depends on two different versions of the same library, you have to use an alias in the Cargo TOML file.
Okay.
Which means you already like can differentiate between them by using the different name. But yeah, otherwise you can also have like different versions in like transitive dependencies, right?
Really?
And then you get like these fun errors when you try to use the type from one of the versions in the API of the other version. And then like, at least I don't know if they changed that, but the compiler used to complain about these types not being the same and then rendering the exact same types, saying like these are not the same when they clearly look the same because they were from different versions of the library and those are different crates. Therefore, I think they kind of fixed it by now printing that these are from different crate versions. I hope at least they did, because it was very confusing back then.
Okay. Yeah, I guess it makes sense. I mean, I guess the way Rust works, it's okay to have that problem.
Yeah, if Cargo disallowed having like different versions of the same crate altogether in your like dependency tree, I don't think there's a single project that will build nowadays. Just adding like a few bigger dependencies usually just leaves you with the fun. What are some dependencies that are usually differentiating version a lot? I think like parking lot is something you very often see duplicated, and like the rent crate as well, because some crates take a long time until they update their dependency versions for these.
Okay. Yeah, I've heard of parking lot, but I haven't used it yet.
Yeah, I think it's even duplicated in the Rust Analyzer dependency tree.
I was just thinking, like, in general, you may have this problem because, like, Tokyo has been used by so many places, and then if you want to use it, how do you say that? Yeah, I mean, like, I think it took some time when Tokyo went 1.0 for people to kind of catch up, if I remember correctly. This is obviously a while ago.
I think the Futures crate also had the problem, like, when it swapped, I don't know, from 0.2 to 0.3, suddenly, like, the ecosystem was split or something. I don't quite remember. And I think there was also this thing called the libc apocalypse. Was it called that? I don't quite remember, but there was something with like the libc crate where it got like bumped from one version to another. Okay. And I don't know, like it was a huge problem because so much broke from it, I think. I don't quite remember the event, but it's also something fun to look into if someone is bored, like just checking for the libc version bump problem or what it was.
Yeah, I know what you mean. How do I say? I'm sure it's problems had before. There's no perfect programming language. For sure, I do know there's one programming language that I work with like every day called Elixir, and they have a flat kind of structure. And so if you say, give me all the dependencies, it'll tell you, oh, but this one depends on this one, that one depends on that one. It's not going to work. So you got to figure it out. And so in the end, you could just override it and say, this version I want to use and this one. So that's the way they kind of work with it because the way the programming language is kind of structured. Mm-hmm. So, but I can understand that, okay, with like Rust, it's possible because in the end, I mean, you're not going to keep the name unless you have the debug symbols, but even that, like, you can just change the underlying computer name, right? It's just text for the debug files, if I remember correctly. All that debug information, I forget what the heck that stuff is called. Yeah, same here. Shake my head. Yeah. No, I don't remember.
I'm not well informed about this either. Is it PDBs, I think? Are those the debug files?
something
is that
like
a
that.
Windows only thing? I don't remember.
Sorry. So how do I say? Yeah, but going back to Rust Analyzer, so we kind of talked a little bit about like an informal definition, right? We took the very unclear definition on the Rust Analyzer homepage and
Right.
tried to make it a little bit more clear, and I think that was kind of clear enough because, yeah. But what I think would be good to kind of talk about is like, how does this thing actually get installed? Because when I look it up, it seems like if you just install like Rust Analyzer plugin for VS Code, then it's there. Like, is it part of the toolchain? It gets installed automatically?
Yeah, so distribution problem, I guess, it was a bit tricky to get done right. So in the past, basically, when you installed VS Code plugin, we actually had like code in the VS Code client part of the extension to download the server binary from the GitHub artifacts and then put that in the right place. So we had to deal with like updating the binary whenever something released and like all that manual handling basically, which worked often enough, but sometimes it failed annoying ways. Now, I think a year ago, VS Code finally like added something to their marketplace that allows you to upload binaries with the extension. So now we don't have to do this anymore. If you download the VS Code client extension, it immediately also fetches the binary that belongs to it, so the server. So VS Code installation is very smooth now. It should usually just work by clicking the install button. For other clients, like if you're, I don't know, a Vim user, Emacs and whatnot, you usually have to fetch the server yourself, which either means you fetch it from the GitHub releases, or what you can now do is also install the Rustup component, which also ships Rust Analyzer since 4 versions ago on stable, I think, something like that. But the main downside with that is that this binary is usually pretty outdated compared to what you can get from the master branch, right? And because it's also only updated every 6 weeks, which is the stable release cycle, sometimes there's a buggy version on the Rustup component where like there's an annoying bug with like, I think the last one we had was that some of the configs were passed incorrectly. And well, that basically stuck on the stable release for like 6 weeks because no one from us really did a backport because we don't know how that works. And we also don't really want to put in the effort to figure that stuff out because that's also time we could just spend on improving Rust Analyzer. Like the Rustup component is basically, we push for it because it's nice to have, but not because we want to deal with it. It's just a lot of people wanted to have the component, which I can totally understand. It's obviously a nice experience installing this server from the component instead of having to go to the GitHub repo and then fetching the release there and putting the binary in the correct place and whatnot.
Now, where is the correct place exactly where the Rustup component goes? They're all going to the same place?
That's a good question. For VS Code, it's basically just in the extension folder, right? By default. Otherwise, I believe, at least for VS Code, you can specify the server path in a config setting. So then it's basically wherever you want to have it. And for other clients, I don't know. I assume you always have to just specify the server location there. I'm a VS Code user, so I've never touched any of the terminal-based like editors. So I have no idea how even configure those. So if you install it as a Rust component, the server, I think, it should be in your path. So I assume most editors will just pick it up that way by just looking for the Rust Analyzer executable, which should then also look in the path, right? But yeah, that's something I'm not too familiar with, like aside from how VS Code does it.
No, is that the one that says Rust Analysis? That's the Rust Analyzer?
No, the Rust Analyzer executable has a few more commands, but not Rust Analysis, I think. I mean, the component is not installed by default, I believe. I think you have to fetch it separately via Rustup.
Yeah, because I know I added a couple of things, I believe. I mean, Clippy. Oh, you know what? I think I remember now. Remember my previous one about the Rust Analyzer kind of somewhat competitor? Isn't RLS? Isn't that the Rust language server?
Oh, yeah. Okay, now I see.
You made me feel like I'm going crazy. I'm not angry.
Yes,
I'm a little bit angry at you.
Now I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, That's
All right.
kind of like a competitor, right? So my understanding at the time, RLS was like the stable version of Rust Analyzer that didn't have as many features and wasn't as good, but it was stable and could be used and whatever. Rust Analyzer is better in all features, but not so stable. But that may have changed since this was, I think, last year, maybe a year before that was my understanding. It may have, RLS may be gone by now.
Yeah, that's a good topic to talk about actually, about the Rust language server. So yes, the RLS was basically the first language server implementation for Rust. It was also official. So it was like done by the project itself. And the thing about it is the way it worked is basically it invokes the compiler with specific flags to make it emit a lot of semantic info in a JSON format. I believe that might even like just be analysis as a name, the output format. Thing is, it used this JSON format then to basically pass the compilation state and figure out the state of the project from that. So it could run completions via this information. It could like show you documentation on Hover. And the nice thing about this is because it is very much integrated with the Rust compiler, it uses the internals and whatnot. It was always basically matching up with the compiler you have in terms of features and feature understanding. So you always had the latest thing there. The problem with it is this workflow is not suitable for an IDE. You want your IDE to be fast. You want it to be incremental and to just be lazy, so not do any unnecessary works. But because the way the Rust language server worked is that it always had to invoke the compiler on every change. It basically had to do an entire like recompilation to the semantic stage, which means just a lot of work, a lot of unnecessary work as well, which is basically where Rust Analyzer comes in, which was written from scratch with the idea in mind of actually replacing the Rust language server at some point. There was even an RFC about it, which is all something that has happened in the last year now, which means when Rust Analyzer moved into the Rust language organization, we basically replaced the Rust language server and even sunset it now. So I believe the component is still there on Rust Up for the Rust language server, but I believe it is now empty and will just basically notify you. Like it's just an executable that says this thing is no longer supported. And I think the reason they can't remove it because of like Rust Up reasons, like components cannot disappear, I think, something like that. And likewise, the Rust language server VS Code extension also, if you install it now, it will just like tell you this thing is no longer supported. You can either stick with this old version of the Rust language server, or you can install Rust Analyzer, which is supported and maintained now. But yes, back then it was basically a competitor because feature-wise, Rust Analyzer was still rather weak. And so RLS, like the Rust language server, usually worked better for most people. But those differences should be basically all gone by now, roughly.
Yeah, I knew it. You're making me go crazy over here. I'm like, I know there was something.
Yeah, sorry. I didn't think of it as a competitor because I know from my perspective now.
Because you won. You can't compete.
You could say, yes, you could say that. But because I know that project has been sunset, so I know it's no longer a thing. That's why I didn't even think of it.
Yeah, this is something that happened. I wasn't even aware that it was sunset, but it makes sense because nobody talks about RLS anymore. And I remember, like you said, about a year ago, that would make sense because that's when I read this book and they talked about the two. And I think I read a couple of blog posts, but now I never hear about RLS anymore. That's why I couldn't even think about the name because I can't even think of any blog articles or anything that talk about this because people talk about how to set up your Rust environment and they never talk about it.
I think I saw like a blog post from JetBrains a few months ago with like diagram, like a statistic, what IDEs people are using for the Rust development. And I think there was like 1 or 2% on there that were still using the Rust language server, which is quite surprising to me at least. But I guess most companies lock their Rust version they are on, right? And they are like very far back with what their tool chain is like. And I guess like if you're that far back with the version still, you can just use it fine. It's still supported in that sense there. So
yeah, it's interesting. I'm just looking at the GitHub page. So there's two pages, right? The one I read the previous definition of Rust Analyzer was the one on GitHub IO. The one on the GitHub page for Rust Analyzer underneath Rust Lang is also different definition, which is interesting. Maybe you should dedicate a couple of minutes to kind of make them the same. This one is saying Rust Analyzer is a modular compiler front-end for the Rust language, part of our larger RLS 2.0 effort to create excellent IDE support for Rust. A little bit more clear, but in the end, it's actually not necessarily the same because they're not really related to compile time, right? They're not feeding into each other directly.
Yeah, no, we aren't. I mean, Rust Analyzer is just completely separate from the compiler one. Like the only thing we have kind of going with each other in that way is just that we can invoke cargo check for the user and then display the diagnostics inline. Though in an ideal world, that shouldn't even be part of the Rust Analyzer extension. We should actually just lift that out into its own thing. Because it has nothing to do with Rust Analyzer itself, aside from us making it that you can actually apply the mesh and applicable quick fixes that diagnostics can have from like Rust, from the Rust compiler. Like, I don't know, some people might know about it, but cargo check and cargo Clippy have like this autofix flag, I think it's called, where basically if you have warnings in the code that have like suggestions about what to do, you can run the check command with like this flag and it like auto fixes like all these warnings. That's something like Rust Analyzer can also like do for you, like in the editor. Like you can go on the diagnostic and then click quick fix and then it will just rewrite it in the same way.
Now I feel like Clippy and this is the weird thing, like cargo check, Clippy, and Rust Analyzer, I feel like maybe they should all come under one big program. Sometimes I feel like that. Especially like Clippy. Like I just remember my first time writing Rust and like I got rid of all the compiler warnings and everything and I was like, this is great. And then I heard about Clippy and I was like, all right, let me check this thing out because I was just thinking it's like a linter. But like, I don't remember what it was. It was like 100 or 200 or something crazy, like warnings or whatever. I was like, oh my God, why Clippy is telling me so much more than the compiler? Like, what is going on? Like, I felt scared because it's not like, sure, it's a memory safe language, but you're still writing on bare metal. Like, I'm so used to writing like a GC language with a virtual machine in between. I feel like, oh my God, did I do something wrong?
Clippy is an interesting topic, I think, in the Rust community in general, because it has like a bunch of lints. Like, I don't know how many it is, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's hitting like, I don't know, a couple hundreds for sure. Weird thing about it is like a subset of the lints that are like enabled by default, right? But a bunch more that are like opt-in and has like these weird like lint categories like style, pedantic, and what else. And unfortunately, like for Rust Analyzer, for example, we don't actually use Clippy because we do not like the defaults it has. And currently, there's no way to specify project-wide which Clippy lints you want and which ones you don't want. So we basically have like, I don't know, 4 or 5 lints we check on CI because those are important to us, and the rest we just don't enforce at all. So usually what happens is that like every few months we get like some person that just like runs a few Clippy lints over the entire code base and then submit that as a PR to fix some things up, which makes sense because some of these are pretty nice lints, but because we can't disable the ones we don't like or that still have positives, we just cannot enable it on our code base at the moment. So I am very hopeful that progress will be made for the Clippy toml file so that we can just put that in the repo, note down our lints, and be done with it. But until that happens, we will probably just never use Clippy properly.
That's too bad. I think Clippy helped me to become a better programmer. Like the programming language I like to use every day is called Elixir. They're big into pattern matching. Obviously, Rust has pattern matching. It's quite exciting. The one thing, like, I was just trying to make sure that stuff was okay or whatever with an if statement. And like, then I found out, like, Clippy told me, oh no, there's a dot is okay. And I'm like, oh, damn, that's awesome. Like, it taught me things that I didn't even know about. There's a lot of these nice methods that are in the Rust language that I've never knew about until Clippy told me that you could do this stuff. I was like, oh, this is interesting. This is kind of cool. Like, still, the first time you see all the warnings, you're like, oh my God, what happened? And then you start to read it and you're like, oh, okay, this is okay. This is cool.
Yeah, they are really lints, not warnings, right? Like a lot of them are just really like helpful tips about things you can do in a more concise or more readable way. And I mean, usually you say like the standard library is pretty bare bones in Rust instead of like battery included, right? but it's still really massive if you think about it, because there are so many, like just checking the docs for like option, iterator, or result, like these fundamental types. Like beginners have like no way to just know all of that or learn all of that like quickly.
Mm-hmm.
So like Clippy, like suggesting the is okay or is a function, stuff like that. It's just like these small things that just feed the person more information to learn more about the language. Is pretty neat of it.
Yeah, going back on it, like my code wasn't wrong necessarily, but it could be more idiomatic Rust or more elegant. So that was really what Clippy was all about, at least for me. I think there was generally, I think, some warning issues or something too that actually were possible bugs.
Yeah,
if I
there
remember
are a few
correctly.
things. I know like one that triggered for us, for example, which was quite important actually, is a warning about if you have like a struct with interior mutability and put that in const and then use it in a way as if it was a static. That is like no compilation error really. It's just like a semantic, like a logic error basically, which Clippy can actually catch, but the compiler doesn't. And like we had that in the code base for like one specific concept everywhere. It wasn't really a problem, fortunately, because it was for something that is like conditionally compiled just for like debugging purposes. But like there are like some lints that make you think like, why is this like not upstream, not in the compiler yet? Because these are kind of logic errors and it feels like they should be there. But I guess like Clippy usually is also like used to test out lints and see if they make enough sense to be upstreamed into the compiler in the end. I believe that's how most lints actually get like merged into the Rust compiler in the end as well.
Yeah. Well, I'm thankful that we have all these tools, right? I think, I don't know if it's the number one, but definitely top three. One of the things people always say is what's nice about Rust is the tooling. I think tooling, docs, and I think this the general like compiler, if when you're not fighting it. When you're listening to the compiler and being a good individual, let's just say good boy, but good individual.
Yeah.
Those three are definitely way up there. I think tooling is definitely one of the top words I hear from people. Like the tooling is great.
The tooling is by far also like the main reason how I actually stick with the language.
Mm-hmm.
Like every now and then I try to just like jump into another language because it's just nice to like experiment a bit and like acquire a few more. But I can't really pull through with it because the tooling in almost any language is just terrible. Like at least in comparison to Rust, it just feels very bad in most languages. So it might also be that Rust really spoiled me and just made it impossible for me to learn any other language that isn't like on par with like tooling and like language level support. But it is really difficult for me. So, I mean, I basically started with Java, went from there to Python and from there to Rust. And now like all I do is really Rust. Like I can't really touch anything else. A bit of TypeScript here and there because that's what VS Code requires, but it's difficult.
Yeah.
The language is just too nice.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, there's a couple of things I want to get back to with Rust, but just need to have some more time. Yeah, I don't think I have any questions. I mean, is there anything you wanted people to know about Rust Analyzer or something you wanted to say?
Not too much, I guess. I mean, if you have free time and feel like wanting to contribute to an open source project, obviously the perfect place for me to shout out about it. Would be nice to just have like a few more faces, just look through the issue tracker we have to see if like there's a small thing you want to contribute to. Usually we try to make it easy to contribute to the project as well. But aside from that, I don't think I have anything to speak about anymore.
And a shout out, somebody please come up with a better definition that's really concise. I'm not saying what you have right now is bad, but it's not as clear as it could be, I think.
If you have great like skills at describing things and whatnot, feel free to rewrite the entire README we have and front page, and I don't know, I guess the VS Code extension front page as well. There's a lot that can be improved upon.
Yeah, I think there's never enough writers needed for software projects.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think I met a couple of people who are like editors for books and technical books, and their day job is actually like writing, and they love it. Like they're like, I can't program, but I love software and I love writing and I love reading. So this is kind of like a perfect niche for me. Cool. Yeah. I mean, and with that, again, I thank you for your time, and I'm looking forward to this episode coming out.
Yeah, thank you for having me. was a lot of fun.